such a thing.
Reaching the end of a 2-week stay and enjoyed myself very much and getting to know both people from government and students, and it's been a very stimulating experience for me. And my kind of last wish before I leave maybe tomorrow is to have some contact with the university. So I guess my fairy godmother granted my wish, so if I am, it came true. I'll just say that there have been various rhythms or episodes concerning debates over Heidegger and his relationship to National Socialism. Maybe I should just kind of give you what I want to talk about today, and I'll try to make it succinct. Is the relationship between his philosophy and his political engagement in the early 30s for the National Socialist Party. And maybe I'll talk about his political involvement for a minute, just as a prelude to my discussion of the relationship between his philosophy and his politics, which is the theme of my talk. But nominally, to all intents and purposes, Heidegger was born in, not nominally, in point of fact, he was born in 1889, which coincidentally happened to be the same year of famous birth year of a famous German 20th century politician and dictator, Adolf Hitler. Facts of this nature were significant for Heidegger. He was interested in these kinds of elective affinities, and he certainly felt some kind of strange affinity despite his ethereal background in Western philosophy and Hitler's plebeian status. Maybe I just kind of begin with an anecdote that I find significant to kind of piece. There are a lot of pieces to this puzzle that I think one has to get together, fit together to make some sense out of the initial disturbing aspect of this topic, which is that someone who undoubtedly is considered before and after the revelations about the extent of his commitment to Nazism, someone who's considered the, among, say, Wittgenstein, Husserl, perhaps Derrida, Habermas, one of the greatest philosophical minds of the 20th century. How can one reconcile this fact with his involvement or partisanship for a movement, a political movement, a racist political movement, and a totalitarian political movement that seemed to be the negation of everything that Western philosophy stood for? So that's kind of the initial paradox. There are many strands of this mystery to be unraveled. I'll just try to stay with some main ideas and strands and then leave the rest to your imagination or your future research. It's a fascinating theme that perhaps I spent too much time on professionally. I don't know. It seemed time well spent, as Robert Cottrell was nice enough to mention. I published several books on the topic. My first book was called The Politics of Being. In German, it's Seinspolitik. It sounds better in German than in English. Because, of course, Heidegger is a philosopher of being. And the Seinsfrage, or the question of being, was his, to reintroduce this in the context of modern philosophy, where the predominant concern was epistemology, or theory of knowledge. Heidegger wanted to go back to scholasticism, but behind scholasticism to the classical Greeks, Aristotle, the notion of ousia, or presence, or being as it's translated. But even this is one of the funny aspects of Heidegger as a philosopher. Not that you would laugh about it, or there are a lot of jokes, peculiar aspects, is that he ultimately Heidegger found the classical Greek philosophy, the Socratic school, like Nietzsche, he found it too modern, too contemporary, especially Plato's notion of the ideas. In Heidegger's history of philosophy, he gave all these lectures, during almost 50 years as a university lecturer on the history of Western thought, Western philosophy above all. But he thought that the fall, and it has biblical connotations too. It's the same word in German as in English, der Fall, of Western philosophy was Plato's notion of the ide, or ideas, which separates intellection or thought from being. So you get this fatal separation of the notion of philosophy as representation, which in German philosophy is an important concept. In Kant, you have this idea of Vorstellung. Schopenhauer's famous work in the early 19th century is the world, die Welt aus Wille und aus Vorstellung. World is will and idea. Okay, this is an important concept in modern German philosophy. Heidegger wasn't very well versed in other philosophical traditions. He thought that if one was to philosophize properly in the 20th century, one had to speak German, and he thought there was a strange, I think this is philologically incorrect, but we'll just leave it at this for the moment. There was this strange, kind of etymological and linguistic affinity or connection between Greek and German. This is a major trope in German cultural history from the 18th century, from Winkelmann on to Nietzsche as a classicist, that the Germans are the true heirs to Greek culture. And of course, conversely, there's a lot of nationalism in philosophy. That's important to understand, clearly, because the French culture, which has a Latin basis, we claim to be the heirs of certain more Latin traditions, etc. So we talked in the Isaiah Berlin seminar about the influence of Heidegger and the specificity of individual peoples developing their own identities, etc. Philosophy plays a role on a more kind of ethereal or exalted plane of developing self-understanding and self-consciousness of a nation. This might seem to be, a bit conjectural or speculative or irrelevant to everyday considerations of politics and culture and life practice. There's a curious fact that the German self-understanding in the 19th century was as a people of thinkers and poets, or poets and thinkers, Dichter und Denker. Germany thought of itself often as a Kulturnation, as opposed to the other European nations. England, whether or not that's part of Europe, we can discuss. They are part of Europe. England and France that have certain political breakthroughs in terms of representative government. There's a pride in being apolitical or anti-political. You see it in Nietzsche. Nietzsche famously described himself as the last anti-political German. He was very disappointed at the emergence of the Second Reich under Bismarck, for example, and withdrew to cultural philosophy of sorts. And Heidegger, too, the fact that when he established his reputation in the 1920s as a lecturer with his great book, Sein und Zeit, or Being in Time, in 1927, I've actually met students of his at the time, but I don't have to rely on personal testimony. There's also ample written testimony. It was commonplace that Heidegger in the 1920s was apolitical. Well, what does that mean? To be apolitical is still a form of being political. Depends how you define political. One can be antagonistically disposed toward political parties, toward constitutions, One can be in favor, and I think the parallel with Nietzsche is very important. One can be an enthusiast of what one might call metapolitics. One can circumvent normal parliamentarism, which is in German. If any of you speak German, obviously it's kind of sometimes hard to talk about Heidegger without illustrating the German words, but the notion of parliamentarism is, in German you say it's a Schimpfwort, a term of derision, a term of disparagement. Okay, so there's a profound, as you might imagine, this is kind of 20th century history 101. After World War I, the proclamation of the Weimar Republic, which only lasts 15 years, there's a lot of anti-Republican sentiment. It's widely sensed on the part of the German right that this form of government was imposed by the Allies. Hence, it really didn't have a wide mass, especially among the elites. The army, the bureaucrats, the judiciary, and especially university professors. Many of these elites were holdovers from the Second Empire, the Wilhelmine Empire. And then you had a young generation. Heidegger served in World War I. He was a meteorologist. He would send up balloons to see which way the wind was blowing to warn about gas warfare. So he really didn't see front experience, which is a big existential proof of one's worth in post-World War I Germany. They have a term that they eulogize to describe this called the Fronterlebnis. Erlebnis, of course, means experience in Germany. And Heidegger somewhat fabricated his involvement, and people think, one of the key concepts in Being in Time, his great work of 1927, is Sein zum Tode, being toward death. And there is some sentiment that one can't understand the importance of the category of death in Heidegger on a purely philosophical basis or level, but certainly part of the categorical framework of Being in Time comes out of the Fronterlebnis, or the front generation, which left such a profound wound, not just on the German psyche, but the European psyche as well in so many respects. And of course, clearly, one thing, kind of meta remark I want to make about Heidegger is that there's a famous saying he has later in life. It's a bit apologetic, and I believe it's actually a quote from the French writer and poet, Paul Valéry. He who thinks greatly errs greatly. Okay, it's kind of an excuse for his errors, which were at times egregious and significant. I'll talk about his political errors in a minute. But I think to kind of stand back and frame my interpretation of philosophy and politics in Heidegger, I think it's important to realize that, to use a figure of thought, blindness and insight are always interwoven. One has great insights and also great errors. And my particular complaint or lament against the dominant strain of Heidegger interpretation is that it tends to be very uncritical. It tends to be adulatory, admiring, and one has a lot of attention to use this phrase from Paul Valéry, a lot of attention to his greatness, which certainly is evident, but little attention to the error. In German, it's Irrnis, the errors. So, kind of part of my impetus in researching Heidegger is to try to balance out the dominant interpretations. I feel that in the university setting, there are theology faculties, etc., but I don't think the study of philosophy should turn into the study of theology or religion or a form of worship or adulation. I think this is a sacrifice of the critical spirit that one needs in any, not just in any university discipline, but to go about making intelligent judgments as a citizen or in everyday life. So that's some of the background of my interest in Heidegger. But let me come now to a couple of particular points. And at various times in trying to, fit the puzzle together, or parts of the puzzle together, it is a bit of a enigma, this topic that I addressed today. I want to begin by with a remark, we would say in English, metaphorically speaking, a pregnant remark, a remark with consequences that Heidegger makes to his fellow philosopher and fellow German existential philosopher, Karl Jaspers, in 1934. It's a year after Heidegger, although nominally apolitical in the 1920s, in 1933 he has this dramatic political coming out or profession of faith in the Nazi Party. And, as I say, in terms of this motif or theme of blindness and insight, Heidegger, either to his credit or to his detriment, never did anything by half measures. So when he joined the Nazi Party, he did it on the party day, which the Nazis had replaced May Day, the left-wing holiday, the socialist holiday, with the Nazi Party Day, May 1st, 1933. This is only 3 months after Hitler's Machtangreifung, seizure of power. This is when Heidegger joins the Nazi Party, and he's elected in a bit of a controversial way as rector or president of Freiburg University, which is controversial from a number of standpoints, because the university had always had a tradition of self-governance by the university senate, and Heidegger was having joined the Nazi Party, he wanted to play a leading role in what is called historically the Gleichschaltung process, which was a euphemism employed by the Nazis in the early years after the seizure of power for the elimination of political opposition, for getting everything, literally it's almost a metaphor from railway jargon, getting everything on one track. Of course, that one track led to the Nazi Party, Hitler in Berlin, and the movement. Everything, Nazification of German society. So Heidegger played a leading role in 1933 in the Gleichschaltung of the German university system, getting things on one track. He sent a famous, I'm just giving you some examples now. He sent a telegram, incriminating telegram, to none other than Adolf Hitler in May 1933, very early on, asking Hitler to postpone a national meeting of the German university rectors until, and this is the word he uses in the telegram, Gleichschaltung could be complete. In other words, until the non-Nazi rectors could be purged. It's interesting, I think, to reconstruct why. There are other examples too of his involvement. Just a couple of tidbits. Heidegger was an activist. He went around Germany giving speeches on behalf of the regime. He was very active in the fall of 1933. Germany, in October, Germany dramatically withdrew from the League of Nations, the precursor of the United Nations. Hitler had, his favorite, one of his favorite political tactics was the plebiscite, or the referendum. So he held a referendum to have, this was the will of the people. And Heidegger played a major role, or a significant role, in traveling around the university and, speaking to the German educated classes. I mean, he was Germany's really most prestigious philosopher, who had developed in a few short years, since the publication of Being and Time, an international reputation. Hannah Arendt speaks of his renown already as a lecturer in the early 20s. Hannah Arendt talks about the rumors of a hidden king. Up till 1927, Heidegger published virtually nothing. but yet his reputation as a brilliant lecturer in Freiburg had spread throughout Germany, and well, I've never had this problem, but he had to hold his classes about 7 in the morning because the lecture halls would fill up so quickly, and otherwise they would be kind of, flooded. There's a lot of myths that have arisen around Heidegger, and sometimes it's hard to figure out what is myth and what is reality, but sometimes good stories are worth telling too, so have a certain representative value. What I think is, I want to kind of finish framing his political involvement. Heidegger was disappointed in his rectorship, his political involvement. It lasted a short time, really. His rectorship only lasted a year, although he remained a dues-paying member of the National Socialist-driven Workers' Party, the Nazi Party, through 1945. What happened was that, as often happens in politics, there were practical disagreements with the Nazi hierarchy in the local province of Baden, where he was active. One of Heidegger's misdeeds, though, in the short time he was rector, was that he delivered Freiburg University to the National Socialists. I talked a minute ago about its tradition of self-government. Heidegger, a believer in the Führerprinzip, that is, the translation doesn't work, but we translate it into English as leadership principle, and it's a principle of authoritarianism, that we don't do things democratically, but the will of the Führer is the absolute law. Actually, Heidegger uses this phrase in one of his speeches on behalf of the referendum to withdraw from the League of Nations in 1933. The Führer is Germany's only law and reality. One of the disturbing aspects of this riddle I'm trying to unravel about the relationship between his philosophy and politics is that Heidegger often, very frequently, uses terminology from his philosophy very explicitly and very demonstratively to justify his involvement with National Socialism, which leads one to believe or suspect that, and this is one of my kind of key points, is that the relationship between Heidegger's thought and his political practice wasn't accidental, contingent, fortuitous, but there were strong elective affinities between his, what he would call his own philosophy, Existenzphilosophie. He never referred to it as existentialism, which is kind of the commonplace now, Sartre's existentialism. He somewhat followed in Heidegger's wake in different ways. But Heidegger used this stronger term, Existenzphilosophie, a philosophy of existence. And Heidegger has a very specific sense of what existence means. And most of being in time is an elaboration of existence. I'll just point out an important philosophical fact about Heidegger's approach to philosophy. I've already mentioned for a second that Heidegger was averse to the modern tension, the Cartesian point of departure of epistemology, the self-understanding of human beings as thinking substance, res cogitans, starting with the thinking self, the ego, which is the fashionable or de rigueur in modern philosophy, the point of departure for all transcendental philosophy from Descartes to Kant to Husserl, starting with the transcendental ego. So this is significant that Heidegger calls his approach an Existenzphilosophie, because what does Heidegger start with? He doesn't start with the disembodied mind, or spirit, or Geist, or reason. He starts off with what he calls world relations, being in the world, he calls it, or Dasein, okay? Being there being, Dasein. This is his attempt to surmount the intellectualism, one might say, of traditional Western thought. So you can see there's already in Heidegger, and this is one reason why I think he's had such a great reception in Europe and North America, because he provides, just to kind of stand back for a second, he provides a response or rebuttal to the traditional starting point and potential limitations of modern Western thought, which he traces back to Plato. His conception of what's modern goes back, as I say, to Plato's notion of the ideas, the ide, which are disembodied vis-a-vis the sensibles, vis-a-vis the reality. You have the ideal of the table. The idea of the table is higher than the embodied table. This embodied table, presumably in a few years, will have scratches, and we might have to replace a leg. It's drenched with matter, and matter we know, has a limited lifespan. But the ideas are eternal. Okay, they exist in the firmament. So Heidegger's criticizing idealism from the standpoint of existence. Now my criticism of Heidegger has to do, and I'll get into this in a minute or two, with the fact that what he calls, his categories he calls existentials, existentialien in German. And my critique, in a nutshell, the irony is Heidegger considers himself a philosopher of temporality too, not only existence, but that's being in time. Okay, he believes that in philosophy's traditional search for eternal truths, such as Plato's ideas, etc., Descartes' first principle, I think, therefore I am, that philosophy has traditionally neglected temporality, the temporal nature of human existence. In a way, this is something he takes from his interest in Protestant theology and Augustine and Martin Luther and Calvin anyway. Be that as it may, my critique suggests that as a philosopher of temporality, Heidegger is always very upfront or forthright about the fact that he philosophizes from his own temporality, the temporality of his own I, his own Ich, which is his own Dasein, his own rootedness in 1920s Germany, let's say. So, and historicity is another category of his thought. Not history, but historicity, which is related to temporality, the fact that we exist in a historical setting, let's just say, that our being is a historical category. That would be kind of almost a collective or group notion of temporality or historicity. I don't know what Latvian historicity is or European historicity, but Heidegger tries to answer these questions formally, not in terms of empirical events, but conceptual and philosophical. It's an interesting problem. Anyway, so my critique has to do with the fact, in the main, that, yeah, Heidegger believes in temporality, Heidegger believes in historicity, and he says this is the basis for his philosophy. So I take him literally, and I would say critically, that the categories of being in time, so-called existentials, existentialien, are saturated in historicity of right-wing German thought of the 1920s. So I believe there are a lot of, so one can read Heidegger in a couple ways. One can read him in terms of the continuum of the history of Western philosophy in dialogue with Plato, above all the pre-Socratics, whom he eulogized. He thought that the Socratic school was too modern and too rational. Socrates' fascination with syllogisms was already the fall of philosophy. So he went back to the pre-Socratics and the concept of being and Parmenides, etc. That's one way of reading Heidegger in dialogue with Descartes, whom I mentioned, Kant. He has lecture courses on all these figures. Another way of reading him would be to see the affinities he has with leading representatives of the so-called conservative revolutionaries in the Weimar era, who weren't, strictly speaking, philosophers, but equally influenced the approach of being in time in terms of the definition of Dasein, and especially Heidegger's notion of everydayness. It's the division one of being time has to do with what he calls Alltäglichkeit, or everydayness, everyday life. And it's a very conservative critique of everyday life in a way. It's an elitist critique of sorts. Even has authoritarian tendencies, especially then when you get to Division 2, and he actually talks about, in paragraph 74 of Division 2, where he starts talking about historicity, the kind of collective historical dimension of a people. He mentions concepts such as choosing one's leader. In German, there's no way of getting around the fact that this is 6 years before Hitler's seizure of power, but choosing one's Führer. This isn't a reference to Hitler, but it's a reference to an authority. Choosing one's leader. He talks about Generation, generation. Of course, he considers himself to be a member of the front generation, as I said. And he talks about the life of a people, which in German, of course, is Volk. Now, all these terms are not Nazi terms. They're ambiguous. They cut two ways. On the one hand, they're just terms from. This is one of Heidegger's distinctions as a philosopher, is that he avoided the traditional terminology of Western philosophy, which he thought was compromised by metaphysics and by the degenerate nature of the history of philosophy. Its preference for eternal truths and conceptual truths as opposed to existential truths. So one of his breakthroughs in being in time is he called all these terms like Dasein. Dasein is, it's Umgangssprache, it's colloquial speech in German for, just kind of being there, existing, etc. My existence. Okay, but Heidegger elevates it to a philosophical category. So it's an ingenious move in a way because he's making everyday life philosophical. And when we talk about this is what Sartre saw immediately. When we talk about everyday life in a strong philosophical sense. But to come back to my critique, I think that I can't detail the whole thing right now, but I'll give you some insinuations and hints. Is that I think that if one reads Heidegger as he should in part be read, in terms of his own notions of historicity and temporality, that there is a profound affinity with figures like Oswald Spengler, who wrote Decline of the West. There's a worldview in being in time. It's drenched in an ideological dimension as well as a philosophical dimension. In a way, one can't absolutely separate those two out. They go together. The ideological dimension, or the worldview dimension, in German it's Weltanschauung, worldview, is not National Socialist by any means. I think it has more affinities with the German radical right and conservative revolutions. I already mentioned Spengler and Carl Schmitt and Mono van den Broek, who wrote a book early on in the 1920s called The Third Reich. And Ernst Jünger, above all, Heidegger, who wrote this famous book, what became a famous book in 1932, called Der Arbeiter, the worker, where he envisages, on the basis of his experiences in World War I, a future totalitarian society which is dominated by soldier workers, where the two functions are inseparable. It's almost this giant beehive. It's eerily prophetic of what would happen to German society a couple of years later. Don't forget the concept of work is really important, or labor, Arbeit, because one of the Nazis' goals was to steal it from the socialists, of course, emphasized proletariat and the importance of factory work. So the German National Socialist Workers' Party had to steal the thunder of the socialists and the communists for the sake of Gleichschaltung, for bringing the workers into a national sentiment and unity, rather than have this split between left and right. Of course, Germany at the end of World War I ended up in a civil war, between the rank and file soldiers and the German elites. The soldiers rebelled. There was rebellion, and there was the declaration of Soviet republics in Munich and in Berlin, etc. So in other words, so I think that Heidegger's categories, I already mentioned being toward death. There's the category of authenticity, Eigentlichkeit. I mentioned choosing one's hero. The whole tenor of his critique of everydayness, das Man, conformity, etc., has tremendous semantic and conceptual affinities with conservative revolutionary thought of his day. I think one can understand. If one tries to read Being in Time only textually or only intraphilosophically, one's going to miss important semantic resonances of its conceptual framework. And this would be a big mistake. kind of two other considerations. At this point in my talk, I can't call them preliminary because I'm certainly more than halfway through. But I just wanted to go back, I kind of skipped over it a few minutes ago, to a representative remark that Heidegger made in response to a query by his compagnon de route, or philosophical friend, Karl Jaspers, in 1934, when Jaspers, who had a Jewish wife and almost lost his life in the course of the National Socialist regime, was banned from teaching as of 1936, played a major intellectual role in Germany's reconstruction after the war. Jaspers was so fascinated by Heidegger, they met in around 1919, 1920, that he kept a notebook, which has been published. It's a big book too, several hundred pages, called Notes on Heidegger. It hasn't been translated into English, I don't think. Notizen zu Heidegger. Just kind of jumpings. He had a whole notebook. Just because he was convinced Heidegger was a significant figure in philosophical presence. He couldn't always make sense of Heidegger's meaning, but he found it kind of head and shoulders above what passed as philosophy in Germany during this time. So it was kind of a fascination, revulsion too. So Jaspers in 1934, after Heidegger makes this sensational appearance, and kind of coming out as a Nazi, and all this involvement, very concerted involvement with the politics of the regime, Jaspers asks him a very simple question. He says, how can you profess allegiance to someone as uncultured as Hitler? After all, Germany thinks of itself as a Kulturnation, and Jaspers, great philosophers. I mean, Heidegger, I have to tell you a little joke in Germany before this anecdote gets finished, is that, he always prided himself on being a provincial from, Schwarzwald, from Tottenberg, the Black Forest, Tottenberg, and he has a famous text from 1934 called "Why I Stay in the Provinces." He got a summons or call for a prestigious professorship in Berlin, and he turned it down very demonstratively. And he even wrote a small text in a local journal. It'd be like, I don't know, no one reads these things. It's like a local magazine. He was proud of it. Yeah. "Why I Stay in the Provinces" is translated to English. It's very strange to see someone who's a great philosopher, possessed of international success. His books have been translated by now, undoubtedly in 50 languages, and this rabid assertion of provincialism. But this is vintage Heidegger, you have to understand, in many ways. And then there's this almost painful moment in the text where one of his peasant friends, I've been to Tottenberg, it's beautiful, it's up in the mountains, no cars can get up there. I stepped in all kinds of cow shit trying to get to the little ski hut where he wrote Being in Time. So he tells this anecdote about, this call, roof, in German, like Luther, the call of conscience to Berlin, and word had gotten around. The local guy, had been summoned to Berlin, and there's this one moment where one of his peasant friends, they don't speak a lot, they just kind of have profound looks, put his hand on Heidegger's shoulder, looked at him in the eye. Heidegger says, "That meant no. That meant don't go to Berlin. This would be a big compromise." Of course, this isn't a philosophically serious text, but it says something about Heidegger's mien, or demeanor, or persona as a thinker, which he's an existentialist. He's not a logician. This has something to do with his thinking, too. He's not a logician, okay? He's not a Cartesian. He's not a transcendental philosopher, right, in the Kantian sense. So, back to my little anecdote. Jaspers, how can you profess allegiance or loyalty to someone so uncultured? In German, it's ungebildet, Bildung. Uncultured as Hitler. And Heidegger turns to Jaspers and says, it's not a question of culture. Look at his beautiful hands. Now, one might think that this is a meaningless remark, or a throwaway remark, just like the exchange with the peasant I was just describing. I consider it a semi-profound philosophical observation, because it expresses the fact very succinctly that when we meaning Heidegger and his contemporaries, or like-minded people, think about politics, it's not a question of, Heidegger didn't like culture. He didn't like high culture. He thought it was artificial. He thought it was kind of an incrustation. He was interested in some things that are more fundamental and existential and basic. That's the driving motive of his philosophy. So when we talk about politics, or metapolitics, the important basis for judging in politics, if you want to use that word for questions of political judgment, which are already too intellectual, are existential grounds, okay? Things like body politics. And so, in a way, Hitler's hands, or the way he moved his hands, the way he used his hands, could tell you more about his abilities and his suitability for leadership, Führertum, than reading Mein Kampf, or his political programs. Political programs are always a source of compromise, etc.
Kind of intuitive politics.
Yeah, very much. Yeah, I mean, because being in time, before you get to, well, anything that resembles things that are too intellectual, you kind of go through questions of world relations and tools, and even has this one category of Verschwiegenheit, which is tacit silence as a mode of discourse. Very interesting. Because he criticizes what he calls das Gerede, which is idle curiosity and also small talk. Gerede is small talk, the kind of chatter that we hear at the marketplace. I don't know if it's the same peasant that was nice enough to put his hand on your shoulder who was doing the das Gerede. It's difficult to blend ontological judgments with everyday life judgments. So of course, Heidegger calls his method fundamental ontology. Okay, what I want to stress now, pardon me a second, I have a little bit of asthma, so you can, where's Armand? You can edit this from the film. Did you see me in a moment of weakness? Now, what's at stake here? And I'll just talk for a few more minutes. What's at stake here in unraveling the mystery of Heidegger and politics? Now, suffice to say, if we began judging philosophers on the basis of their political choices, Plato, the tyrant of Dionysus at Syracuse, where Plato tried to realize his doctrine of philosopher kings, and I don't know if you know the story, but Plato had to flee for his life. If we judge philosophers by their political views, in many cases, we have no textbooks left. It's very unfortunate. I mean, Nietzsche, Superman, whatever. I think it's worth pointing out. This isn't a philosophical point. It's a political point that in Heidegger's case, we're not just judging ideas, but actions that supported, of course, played a practical role in one of the worst dictatorships known in human history, certainly in the 20th century. There's only one other rival, which would be Stalin's dictatorship, and the two had period affinities. And Hitler learned a lot from looking across to the east and from the practices of Lenin. I mean, it's no accident. The 5-year plan that Stalin instituted in the late 20s, there's kind of a fraternal enmity there between dictators, but that's another issue. It's worth pointing out, to round out the political and biographical aspect of this saga, that Heidegger's crimes weren't just kind of thought crimes, kind of having wrong judgments. They're actually, it has to do with acts that were criminal. How criminal? Well, there was denazification commission in Freiburg University in 1945, meaning the Allies went in, the French, the British, the Germans, of course the Russians, Soviets went into East Germany, but Heidegger Freiburg, where he taught, was in the French zone. But there was an autonomous university commission comprised of German non-Nazis that had to denazify the university, just like, well, I don't know many parallels. The lustration laws in Central Europe in the aftermath of communism, where no former communists, or in Germany, Stasi, Czech Republic has lustration laws, and you probably have some familiarity with these problems. So the denazification, they had, it's a difficult problem. What do you do with someone like Heidegger, who hadn't been active for the last 10 years of the regime, but played a very important role in the first couple of years, and was vocal, vociferous, to use French, plus loyal is plus roi. He wanted to be more radical than Hitler in certain ways, in his own respect. So Heidegger was found guilty by the Denazification Commission of having helped, the first few months of Hitler's dictatorship, it wasn't really clear where it would go. Hindenburg was still president, it wasn't all Nazified yet, so this was a crucial, transition point. Heidegger was found guilty by the sympathetically disposed Denazification Commission of having played a crucial role in the early months of National Socialism, lending credibility to the regime.